If you are attending the 2019 AMSA Convention and Exposition, Inside the Boards is going to be there. It'll be me and Chase. We'd love to meet you, connect, and say hi. So we look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to the Inside the Boards podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn to think like a question writer so you can study smarter, not harder, and succeed in medical school.
Welcome to the Inside the Boards podcast. My name's Stewart Bryant. Today we are covering, my final postmortem here with Patrick Bateman, Dr. Patrick Bateman.
That's right. I appreciate if you call me that. I make all my med students call me Dr. Bateman.
That's
not actually true. I don't actually do that. I tell them your colleagues, and you can call me Patrick, and also go home early if there's nothing going on. So I'm a beloved attending at my institution.
Good. Be the benevolent attending that you can.
Plus, I always try to recruit them to help with Inside the Boards, so I have to be extra nice and teach a lot, so it keeps me relevant.
Awesome.
All right, sorry. Let's get into this.
Yeah, so today we're talking, is this part 4, I think, of our postmortem?
It is part 4.
We've talked about a lot of different things, and
we actually recorded this already, but then some computer issues led us to needing to record it again because the sound quality was so terrible. So we should mention that we have a contest going on now. Essentially, just click the link in the show notes or go to InsideTheBoards.com. If you do various actions like leave a review of the podcast on iTunes or share us on social media, you can earn points, and the top point scorers by March 1st will receive 6 months free to our audio Qbank, whose beta iOS app hopefully will be out by the time this is released at the end of February. I know I've been saying that literally for months, but we do actually have a developer who says he's about a week away from finishing. So fingers crossed on that. And if you're a previous subscriber, keep an eye on your email. We'll be sending you instructions on how to access the content in an actual Qbank format. That's all I'll do for announcements today. But today it's what Stewart wishes he knew before his dedicated prep period. Before we do that, though, here is an example from our audio Qbank.
A 59-year-old man presents with exertional chest pain for the past couple of months. He says that the pain is substernal and is relieved with rest. His physical examination is unrevealing. An electrocardiogram is performed and the results are normal, but an exercise tolerance test reveals ST segment depression in chest leads V1 through V4. He is prescribed nitroglycerin to be taken only during the first half of the day. Which of the following statements best describes the reason behind the timing of this medication? Is it A, to prevent collapse, B, to avoid nitrate headache, C, to prevent methemoglobinemia, or D, to avoid nitrate tolerance? And the correct answer is D, to avoid nitrate tolerance. Patients on chronic nitrate therapy may develop nitrate tolerance. Tolerance is a pharmacologic phenomenon which occurs due to repeated use of a drug. The drug effect progressively lowers with the same dosage, and the dosage may be needed to increase to achieve the same effect. However, nitrate tolerance can be prevented by avoiding a continuous steady-state plasma concentration of nitrate. Morning-afternoon-night schedule may produce a continuous plasma steady state of nitrate, thus leading to drug tolerance. Morning-afternoon scheduling gives a nitrate-free interval in the plasma throughout the evening, thus preventing drug tolerance and preserving nitrate efficacy.
All right, so there's an example from our all-audio Qbank. Now, Stewart, let's get into this. So what do you wish you knew before?
All right. So there are quite a few things, but just to like back up, we've already talked about, what I learned. We did an episode on what I did to study and kind of talked a little bit about what I would do differently. So to kind of wrap it up, we wanted to talk about what I kind of wish I had known before going into all of this. And I think that can be some really relatable and useful emotional support kind of advice. Is that the right word to say? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And some practical advice too, knowing what you said before, because these would be things you'd want to pay attention to. If you trust Stewart and he's, more or less trustworthy, these could be things that you will avoid prior to entering your dedicated prep time. So, all right, let's start with point 1.
All right.
Questions. What do you have to say about multiple choice questions?
So that's all you're going to do for studying if you're like me. You're not going to open first aid, whatever, but you're going to start hating doing these multiple choice questions. And the problem with them is like, even though it's really easy to get through and be like, I'm going to do 100 questions in a day, or if you're insane, maybe 200, you're going to be able to get through them, but then you have to sit down and review all those questions. And it's way harder to review all of the questions. If you do like a timed test of like 40 questions, it gives you an hour. Maybe you finish it like a couple minutes early. Maybe you take the whole hour. To sit down and really review 40 questions and like read the explanations, figure out what you did right or wrong, maybe look up another resource to kind of figure out what does Wikipedia have to say about this, or somewhere outside of UWorld or whatever Qbank you're using. You're going to sink a lot of time in reviewing these questions, and you're going to need at least twice as much time. So
did no one tell you this before?
I mean, I had the idea, but really when I was trying to schedule my days, I wanted to have like a pretty equal question to review time. And what that ended up being is if I got a question right, if I were lucky, I would review the objective of the question. And I was only reviewing the questions that I was getting wrong. So it's a lot, really, whatever advice you get for studying and realizing that it's going to take more time to review, that's part of it. But I think what I mean is it's just easier to do the questions than to review them. You could do a bunch of questions and never look at their answers and feel pretty good about yourself, but that's not going to help you when it comes time to take the test, right?
Well, yeah, but would you say there's a difference as you approach the actual study date? Because I would think that if you're still kind of shaky on a subject going in like 6 to 8 weeks, or even now if you're kind of doing some pre-dedicated prep time, you'd want to review basically all of the content to really shore it up in your brain. But as you move towards, that dedicated head down in the books, as it were, really reviewing the things that you don't know, you just switch to looking at your incorrect answers and understanding why you got a question wrong.
Yeah, it's really all troubleshooting. You kind of have your thought process, and if you're able to say, I settled on this answer because of this reason, and I got that wrong. So what was the process that I needed to go through in order to get the right line of thinking? So it's basically just troubleshooting what you've done wrong. That's more important for questions that you've either guessed on or gotten wrong, or you were like having these 50-50 situations. So I recommend if you can review those too, those are just as efficacious for you. If you had a coin flip answer and there were 2 choices and maybe you got it right this time, like that's still a good question to be reviewing.
Yeah. And So with Qbank wise, basically the summary or take home point would be when you make your schedule, don't assume that doing a block of 40 questions in an hour, reviewing either your correct or incorrect answers will only take an hour.
Yeah. And then let me pad that a little bit, because we're going to, another point that I really wanted to make is like, when you're doing your Qbank, you're hopefully going to do it a second time, right?
Yeah.
And if you do it a second time, you're already going to know some of the answers. Like, there's just no way around it. Hopefully you do better because you've learned something using the Qbank, right? So it's kind of harder, or it's easier because you've gotten less wrong, so you have less to review. But you can't really necessarily, part of that is I like to use the UWorld kind of gives you this like where you stand with other people. I think the second pass is much harder to use that to really gauge your knowledge versus what other people are doing, because you just can't trust the score as much. Maybe I'm wrong, but I didn't feel as confident in it on that second pass.
You went through like 5 Qbanks in their entirety over the course of the year prior to your Step 1 exam. So what about using a different Qbank instead of just doing a second pass on, say, UWorld?
And that's actually where I found more benefit, just because honestly, because I would perform worse on them. So like I did an entirely different Qbank while I was in my dedicated period as well. I used the RX, USMLE RX, and that gave me, first off, it had this sort of like predicted score, which I thought was interesting, based on your performance. And then, I was getting more questions wrong in that Qbank because I simply hadn't seen that kind of question before. Or they would be testing some nitty-gritty fact in first aid that really might not be that useful in hindsight.
Yeah. All right.
So talking about like the number of Qbanks I did, which Patrick's exaggerating. I didn't do 5 full Qbanks twice or whatever every weekend or something. To get into like the number of questions you need to do, it's a lot. And part of what becomes a problem is, a lot of these Qbanks want to have very realistic NBME Step 1, related questions. And those are longer. The vignettes just have a lot more details in them. And I thought those are good for really assessing where you are for the NBME, but you probably don't need to be doing long questions all the time. Longer questions, they're more confusing. They require more attention, and you could get the same amount of learning out of a shorter question that really just focused on the main points. So, I guess the thing I wish I had known before is that the longer questions aren't necessarily better for learning. If you can boil down UWorld questions into like a flashcard styled, facts, and you were able to remember them and attribute them to things, like I think that's, almost equivalent, just for getting more facts in. And then something like, one of my favorite, resources during my second year was the Webpath, content, because there's a lot of test questions on there. They're very short, pathology questions, and they really just like drive home a classic vignette and what's going on. Another little app that I had was called Scrub Wars. It's basically a game where you're a little ship and you just shoot the correct answer. You have to be really quick about it, which you'll find if you're a slow test taker might be harder for you. But when I was doing Scrub Wars, I felt like it was very high yield, very short and sweet questions. And I didn't think it was superfluous content, and you could get through 100 of them in a sitting. So it was really easy, right?
So what practically, how did you use that app? Because I imagine you didn't start the morning with playing a Scrub Wars game.
No, I really saved it for, say I was in the car going somewhere, I wasn't driving, right? Obviously don't drive and play video games. But if I was like riding around somewhere, or I was somewhere and wasn't able to get access to my study materials, sometimes I would try to do the app for a Qbank, and I would read through that. But I found that was less efficient than when I was just sitting at my desk at home.
Yeah, because probably as simple as it takes a longer, attention span and the right environment to digest, 2-3 paragraphs worth of material.
Exactly. And then having like the interface, as much as it tries to be suitable for you reviewing the material, it's just a little harder to use on the phone versus when you can pull the whole thing up and just have that whole explanation there. And then again, if you want to go anywhere else and look up material, or you want to flip into first aid and see what they have to say about it, you're not going to be able to do that when you're on the road or in a doctor's office or wherever you might be. Scrub Wars is easy. It was never more than like a sentence of explanation, and you don't even get the explanations until you are, unless you got the answer. Basically, you get the explanation is you got it right or wrong, and you should associate these two buzzwords with this content. And that's really what it focused on, was more like buzzwordy content.
So training, like as I've said, training your kind of memory muscles, or your reflex in terms of training your kind of answer reflex, so that you're kind of like muscle memory, able to associate very quickly, say, classic triads, things like that, without needing to think about it that much.
Oh yeah. And that was the idea of it. And I think it was useful for that. Whether or not you take that stuff long term with you, I don't know.
All right. So last time you had told me that even if you love questions like I do, it becomes very frustrating or nauseating to get to the end and having done thousands of them to keep doing them. What do you mean by that?
So yeah, you get sick of doing questions. It becomes both depressing, and you kind of get this like aversion to doing them. It's like you're shocking yourself every time you have to start another set of questions. So my tendency was to like, I guess I would begrudgingly be starting a new block, or I would honestly be willing to delay it and try to do something else and not study that material just because I didn't want to do any more questions. I like to do I liked doing questions in my period up till, maybe like a week or two into my dedicated period, where I was just doing so many of them. I was just sick of reading about it, sick of starting test, and sick of having to review the answers, right? This kind of carried over to all the kind of test blocks that I needed to start. Say I wanted to do a practice MBME, I would go to do that, and I would have it and I'd be ready to go. And I would like sit there and kind of have to like take a minute and breathe and be like, okay, I just had to start it, and then I'll go through it and it'll be fine. But I would never want to get going, right out the gate, be like, I'm so excited to start these questions. So for people who love studying with the questions, like, the more and more you're doing, the sicker you'll get. And part of that is like, once it's like we're using a shock kind of mechanism, the Pavlov device
Yeah.
where you shock yourself to train yourself for something, to not do something. Honestly, it's kind of like painful to be doing the questions, and you kind of get averse to it, right?
So how do you overcome that?
Ooh, I think it's easier. So one of the things I tried to do was I would go ahead and start a bunch of test blocks, and then immediately stop them on UWorld. So then say I'd already started 4 test blocks with 40 questions. Like I felt more compelled that I had to go in and complete them now. 'Cause you can basically pin to all of them, right?
Yeah.
So that was one of the techniques I used. Other than that, I would, kind of have this little like period of sitting there thinking I don't want to start it, and eventually you overcome it, right?
Yeah.
The goal of wanting to learn eventually overcomes the punishment of having to study. So I think that's basically it for how I felt about questions. I hated doing more questions. Like now I'm very against the questions and I try to avoid them more, which is unfortunate because they're so useful.
Well, hopefully you can get back into that because our platform is kind of focused on multiple choice questions and breaking them down.
Yeah, exactly. It's so bad. And it's so much easier to do this where we talk about a few. But if we were to sit down and do 40 questions, Patrick,
you didn't realize that right after we record this, that's exactly what we're going to do?
Yeah, we're going to go through all the
40
questions.
In UWorld. All right. So what about practice assessments? What do you wish you had known about your NBMEs or other practice evaluation type tests?
So I think basically you're going to want to do assessments. I think in a previous episode, I talked about, how do you gauge yourself? And I was talking kind of nonsensically about doing, based on where you were with how you did on your test in med school and stuff. That's useless. I take that back. You shouldn't do that. You should use either where you fall on the like averages on UWorld, and then you should use your NBME assessments. That's really where you're going to get to see, the main topics, how well you're doing. And those are the main topics that are getting tested. So I was doing practice assessments every week. Couple of times I did 2 practice assessments because I had
you
an
did
extra
just 2 of them during the dedicated or during your whole USMLE Step 1 prep?
During my dedicated period, I did 1 practice assessment on average every week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to clarify. And from that, you can look at it and you can say how well you're doing in the main topics. And then there are a couple of these like more fringe topics that you'll see are harder to do well in. And those are the ones that I would typically find that like my score was able to be improved upon. And that would be something that I would try to focus on. Ultimately, though, those were the fringe topics. So they switch those topics with every test, right? And, you kind of find yourself, even if you're studying up on those, there's no real way to be prepared for them. And I kind of plateaued, trying to study for those like little fringe topics. So my scores in my NBMEs, like about after week 3, they were all pretty consistent with each other. And something that people really like to hear, they're like, which NBME predicts this, this, and this? NBME 18 for me was my score, just for anyone out there who is interested in that kind of stuff.
Okay. So what did you do with that information, or what do you wish, I guess this is what do you wish you had known before? Like you definitely saw an improvement from week 1 to 3 in terms of score prediction, correct?
Oh yeah. And I think part of that is just getting into the mood of like only thinking about how you're answering these questions and just being used to doing the kind of questions that they're asking on the NBME that you're probably not getting similar questions in your medical school content, right?
Yeah. And I mean, with these summative kind of exams, like really the kind of psychometric principle is that if you took this exam today and you got X score, you're likely going to get X score plus or minus, some variance. So did that information influence when you took the exam?
So here's the thing is I got my exam late and scheduled. And, I thought maybe I could move it up, but really there's just too much anxiety around doing that.
Yeah.
Typically if people take the exam at a different time, it's always later. Some people end up deferring extra weeks of medical school. Some end up having to take off like half a year or something because of that. Just because there's like anxiety, not thinking where you are with your studies, or you don't feel like you've adequately prepared based on your learning in med school. And I really think that's a tragedy, but I probably could have taken my exam earlier. And if I had known that, I would have been happy with my score. If I had taken it earlier and had more break time, I think that would have been helpful for me, which kind of leads into my next point. My brain really kind of took a big break after I took that exam. Doing all the questions, studying for it, and just taking it, I was burnt out, and everybody is, right? So you need a decent break to kind of recover. I think
How long should the break be? How long was yours?
So my break was 1 day.
One full day off?
One full day off. And then I started my orientation for third year. I don't recommend that. I would recommend you need, at least a week would be nice, right? And obviously that's hard to do if schedules aren't permitting, but, shooting for a week, and hopefully that can give you some adequate recovery, because you don't think you will need it. But my brain, because of that, and then going right into working, it took about 5 weeks for me to really get over that hump.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway here is, a lot of these kind of either blog posts or forums you read, or even our podcast, this is one person's experience with step one. And it's good to get trusted advice from upperclassmen or, people who've been there and can provide that to either reassure you or help you avoid some of the headaches, frustrations, whatever. Obviously, a lot of advice you're going to have to tailor to your own self, taking, the Delphic Oracle's advice to know thyself. But nevertheless, I would say 100% you have to plan a break before third year. And in order to be able to do that, I think planning some sort of pre-preparation, before you train for a marathon, you might ensure that you've got your diet kind of in place, that you have a plan, that you're generally, ready to start doing long runs. And it's kind of, I think, like that. So what could you do, say, end of February, if you're planning to start really your dedicated prep time in, say, April or May?
Oh, man. So this is one of those things that I know you're a busy medical student in your preclinical education, and you've got no time, and you're just always studying and burnt out, and it's crazy. And it unfortunately, when you become a clinical student and you don't really you're not able to tailor your own time, you realize how much of a crazy schedule you are able to handle. And that's kind of hard to do as a preclinical student when you don't have to be anywhere until 8 a.m. Where now, being somewhere at 8 a.m. is oh, that's lovely. I'm so happy.
Get to sleep in.
Yeah, exactly. So that, your time is valuable, and I understand it's precious, but part of having time management and learning that, you probably have more time than you think you do, and you probably have time to do more before you get to your dedicated period.
So that could look like maybe just flirting lightly with the step one Qbank that you're going to use half a day a week, maybe reviewing some of the things from earlier in second year while they're fresh-ish, or even from first year, just taking 50 to 100 questions a week, dedicating half a day to that.
Exactly. And that's not a lot to ask for. I particularly focused on first year content, because I had taken some extra time. Like I hadn't seen that material in a while. So I focused on those kind of questions, just so I knew a little more about, this kind of esoteric material that really doesn't become, you really are only learning it for step one. I'm sorry to say, but, really to like focus in on some of the biochem, really to review that kind of material. It's a good time to be doing that, because when you get to your dedicated period, you're going to want to breeze through it and not get, bogged down. So if you know those weaker areas that you can spend some time in, maybe your Qbank, or maybe using an outside resource, another kind of like a review book that's more dedicated to a subject that you're poor at, I would highly recommend that. And then, one of the things I knew this going in, but I'll reiterate it to y'all, staying away from the really like low yield, I guess, topics is, I think, a smart idea. I don't think you're going to need to do an in-depth review of embryology in order to be shored up enough for the test. Some people think that that's what they need to do, and I don't think it's a good use of your time, honestly. So maybe even doing that before you get to your dedicated period and then not worrying about it, maybe that's the right idea too.
Yeah, and just reviewing based on the questions that'll be thrown at you in your Qbanks.
Exactly.
All right. What else we got? What else do you wish you had known?
I guess other than, the real like last thing, I guess, is like, it's really hard to be satisfied with what you're going to do. We're all like very driven, competitive people. We're already kind of like at the top tier of education at this point, and you really can't be satisfied with your performance on things. And that's just part of your nature. I really was thinking like I would be happy with my studies, happy with where I was, and like, I just always kind of feel like I can do better. And that's a good thing, because trust me, like, even if you knock out step one and then you get on the wards, you'll find a lot of that doesn't like translate, or you'll forget it, or not know when it's applied. And, you'll realize that there's an entirely different kind of learning that's going to take place. So, just kind of being prepared for the fact that you're going to continually want to do better. And that's you shouldn't get yourself down about that, because this is a tough test, and like everybody has to take it. And like you realize like everybody's smart, and then there's the average score on this test, and that's average, but really that's not average for human intelligence, right?
Right.
So don't get too bogged down or worried about it, or think like, I have to get this score because I'm smarter than other people. Like, really, you are already smart, and this test will be important for like, unfortunately figuring out what schools think you're competitive. But as far as like whether or not you're smart, it has no bearing. And I think that that's important for you to take in before you go start studying and freaking out about your performance on this exam. It's easy to get hung up on the fact that like you're doing below or average or above average or whatever. And, this test isn't what defines you.
Amen to that. That is the takeaway. To quote Dustin Williams from Online MedEd in a previous episode, the USMLE.
It's just a money-making racketeering program.
It's all a scam. All right. Well, that's not entirely true, but it is a good opportunity for you to consolidate information you've learned first and second year, and to give you a good foundation for, reading research articles and understanding pathophysiology, which you'll be pimped on. Probably not as much as you're terrified during third year, but aside from that, like, get into the mindset. Get into the mindset you need to do well, know yourself, and take advice from trusted people, probably not those who are currently in your same situation.
I think those are the main points. What do you think? Call it there?
I say we call it there.
All right, guys. Best of luck studying. Don't freak out. Don't stress. Listen to the Study Smarter series because, that can give you some on-the-go learning. Go buy our Qbank because that's also a good way to get some more digestible content while you're running around and doing whatever else you need to do in your life.
Yep. Amen to that. All right. We'll see you next time.
Today's music is thanks to Matt Tybor from The Bunny the Bear. This track is Secondhand Smoke off The Bunny the Bear's 2017 album, The Way We Rust. Click the link in the show notes or listen wherever you stream music.